Welcome to this webinar, AbleNet University webinar. The topic is Choreographing, Effective Para-educator Support in Inclusive Early Childhood Settings. Again, welcome to this AbleNet University webinar. And today we are going to be focusing on the para-educator's role in that early childhood setting. And three things I want to kind of touch on and emphasize. First and foremost, how do we make sure that support that the para-educator provides is child-specific with the appropriate adaptations? The second thing I want to mention is how do we make sure that the para-educator support is discreet, unobtrusive, and it doesn't hinder the child's growth. It doesn't hinder the child's gaining ability to do things independently. How do we make sure that we are not hovering over the child? And the third thing I will briefly touch on, how do we make sure that the teacher and the para-educators are teaming together so that they collaborate together so that ultimately it leads to meaningful cognitive communication and social emotional competencies for the children. This is an opportunity for us all to find out who is joining us today for this webinar. So let us know whether you are a special education teacher or a therapist, occupational physical speech therapist, or you are a para-educator, the topic that it is dedicated to today, or you're an administrator wanting ideas on how to train people, or you're a parent or other. So I would appreciate if you could let us know who is participating in today's webinar. We have several special education teachers and some a lot of administrators too. So it looks like there is someone who has difficulty. Anyway, I am going to move on to who the participants are. Okay, majority are administrators. And the next highest number of participants are from the special education group. And then we have some support staff and some therapists. Welcome again to this webinar, and we will move on. Okay, it is important for me to introduce who I am. I am an educational consultant, so it gives me the opportunity to visit a number of classrooms, and I do provide on-site consulting as well as workshops for many school districts. And I'm also an author of a number of books and products and music DVDs, and this particular one that you have on this slide is actually a para-educator training program. It's a DVD with multiple units, and it provides district staff trainers how to provide the training with notes on each slide so that they can use the notes to do the training. And I also have books on autism and severe disabilities and early childhood areas. So it is extremely important for para-educators to be trained. The research has clearly indicated it. Also, the whole area of early childhood is gaining greater and greater recognition because a lot more states are expanding their pre-K and early childhood programs. That's one thing. The other reason why early childhood is gaining a lot of attention, but not for something positive, unfortunately, it is a lot of children in pre-K, or that's where the data is available, or either getting suspended or expelled at an alarming rate. So it is important for early childhood teachers and the support staff, the early childhood para-educators in that setting, to receive that training. And as part of this training, it is important for them, for the para-educators, to understand and respond to learner characteristics. Because there are some children who may have just developmental delays. There are some children who may be at risk for developmental delays. And there may be some children whose executive function skills may be delayed, or they may have deficits in that area. So it is extremely important to have a good understanding of the characteristics, the strengths, the needs, and the preferences of young children. And it is also important when you are delivering support to those children, those supports are personalized and child-specific, and it is provided under the direction of the teacher, who is the instructional leader in the classroom. And the para-educator may provide a number of services, and also it is important for them to gain knowledge and experience in a variety of areas, from assistive technology, how to do data collection, how to provide systematic instruction when they are reinforcing what the teacher has taught, and also provide for those children who have significant or severe and multiple disabilities to participate at least partially, so that they are not depending on the para-educator for every step of their activity or the task completion. What research is showing, knowledge is truly power for para-educators. Increasingly, para-educators are being hired to provide individualized and intensive support. In a lot of the cases, it is a one-on-one support, and they are providing services, support to children who have complex needs, children who may have significant learning needs, children who may have significant behavioral needs. And frequently, they do not receive the training that they need in order to be able to do their job proficiently. What they found based on the research is when para-educators were trained, it led to actually improved outcomes for the children, especially when children are included in a general education setting, in an inclusive setting, and I'm hoping that is the case for majority of the children in early childhood, and they are not in a self-contained setting. It led to increased social interactions, it led to student independence, and it reduced the disruptive behavior when para-educators were trained, and the training was an effective system of training. So let's first look at the clarity in terms of role for the para-educators. Sometimes when you go into the classroom, as I do frequently, I can't even make out who is the teacher and who is the para-educator in the classroom, which is perfectly fine because both of them are actively involved in working with the children. But there are certain roles that are teacher-only roles, and there are certain things that the para-educator and the teacher may do together, and there are certain things that the para-educator may be more responsible, and it may vary from district to district. But it is extremely important right at the outset to get clear clarity in the role. What are some teacher duties and what are some para-educator duties? Because sometimes when I am visiting the programs, I do hear some concerns by the teacher that they feel kind of not able to guide because sometimes the paraeducators feel that they know more than the teacher and they can make the decisions. But it is the teacher's role to be the instructional leader in the classroom. And the teacher works out kind of the plans and the IEPs, and the teacher kind of works out a plan for implementation of the IEP and the behavior plan implementation, and guides the paraeducator in assisting the teacher in implementing that. So let's move on to what are some broad guidelines. There are certain responsibilities that the teacher alone. For example, usually it is the teacher who may meet with the parent to discuss some issues with regard to the child, or in terms of a parent conference, and certainly in terms of developing an individual education plan, IEP, and it is the teacher who may be presenting information to parents and the others in an IEP meeting, unless due to some special circumstances, or the paraeducator is also invited, but the teacher usually plays the most important role. And it is important for the paraeducator, and to emphasize it right at the outset, that they respect these role differences. And also it is important for them to know right at the outset what you should do and what they should not do, what the paraeducator can do and what the paraeducator cannot do. And it is important for them to find out what are their assigned duties and clear up any confusion right before they start the school year, so that the collaboration can run smoothly and the children will benefit from the paraeducator support. And they do play a very important, essential role in supporting the children. So what are some paraeducator duties in a broad manner? They are responsible in providing that support, and they may be helpful in preparing and modifying some of the materials under the direction of the teacher, especially when they go into a general education setting. They are making sure they are taking these support materials to assist the child. And they may be providing some personal care, personal hygiene they may be taking care of for a child who may need that kind of support. They may also provide small group and one-on-one instruction to reinforce material that has already been instructed or provided. The child has been provided that instruction by the teacher, and the paraeducator provides a follow-up instruction, follow-up reinforcement and practice sessions. And there may be some clerical and housekeeping duties, and they should be meeting with the teacher on a regular basis, and there should be also be meeting with a special educational or resource teacher, depending on the setting, to gain any kind of additional knowledge and skills. If there are some issues, they should be discussing with the teacher, with the support person, with the speech pathologist, in order to get additional ideas on how to support, how to ensure that inclusion is working out for the child. And they may be gathering data, and they will be supervising, monitoring the child, maybe along with the teacher in a playground setting, or in the assembly, or in the lunchroom if they are staying all day. And they will also be the most important thing in helping the teacher in implementing the behavior plan. And there are certain ethical and legal responsibilities that the paraeducators should adhere to. And again, there would be a district policy, and they should be, first and foremost, be familiar with those district guidelines and follow that. And they have to practice those standards and follow the ethical conduct. One of the most important things is to make sure that they follow the chain of command. And the next critical thing is to be diligent in following confidentiality rules. They cannot, for example, disclose and discuss a child's behavior issues, child's special education needs, child's disability category related issues, for example, in the teacher staff room or out in the playground, anywhere because it is gone
Padmaja, we are having audio issues. Everything is garbled right now.
Uh-oh. So do you want me to call back again?
Oh, no, now it seems to be working again. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, do you want me to go back to the previous slide or just continue with this one? Okay.
Go ahead and start with this slide. Thank you.
Okay. As I said right at the beginning, if you didn't hear me, it is extremely critical for para-educators to follow the chain of command. And they also have to respect the confidentiality rules in order to protect the child, especially children who are who have special needs, who have disability. It is important for them to follow the district policies with regard to IEPs and report any child abuse or neglect, and participate in parent conferences if they are invited by the teacher or by the administrator, and communicate with families with and under the direction of the teacher. And of course, the most important thing is to respect the rights and the dignity of the child. Here I would like to mention the person-first language. It is always important for everybody and also for the para-educator to use a child with a disability and not a disabled child. A child with intellectual disabilities and not a child who is intellectually disabled. It is extremely important to respect this and use person-first language. Okay, what are some basics of the instructional support role that the para-educator plays? It is important for the para-educator to know and get an idea of the developmental milestone, kind of the age-related expectations for young children. Because sometimes we expect 3-year-olds to be writing their names. 3-year-olds really do not have that kind of fine motor control to write their names. They are not developmentally ready to do that. If they want to scribble on paper, if they want to write their name on their paper on their own, that's fine. But sometimes we provide hand support and we physically guide them to write their name. And that's not appropriate for a 3-year-old. We have to wait for the child to be ready developmentally. So it is important, that was just one example, to be ready for children at their developmental expectations. We have to be knowledgeable about it. And the second thing, we have to ensure that the environment that they are in is favorable. For example, children with autism and children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder have a high degree of stress that they experience. And especially if the environment is very distracting and there is a lot of visual overload in the classroom, then it can negatively impact their ability to attend to instruction. So that is where the para-educator can play a critical role in noting down what is impacting the child, and as a team they can discuss how to support that child, how to make sure the environment is friendly to the child, and not to seat the child close to a door or close to a noisy section of the environment. And the third thing, it is important for the para-educator to build on the instructional skill sets that she has. In other words, let me give you an example. If a child is experiencing difficulty in learning new concept, it is important for the para-educator to learn how to break that task down. Hopefully, the teacher will provide the guidance in providing systematic instruction and errorless prompting. I will go over it briefly in a later slide, so that the child is learning from that instructional support when that instruction is something to reinforce what the teacher has already taught. So that the practice sessions go smoothly and the child is gaining information, gaining concept knowledge from that, from the para-educator, gaining those instructional skill sets. And the other one is a lot of children with significant needs and may have autism, intellectual disabilities, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. They may need specific supports, specific adaptations. And these adaptations need to be implemented with consistency and fidelity in the general education setting, in the inclusive setting. And these were, I'm sure, agreed during the IEP meeting, and they have to be consistently implemented, and that's where the para-educator will play a critical role in making sure these are implemented. So the para-educator needs to be knowledgeable in implementing these. And one of the most important things to me is that the para-educator does not kind of make the child dependent on her. It is so that she shouldn't be, or he shouldn't be, promoting learned helplessness, but the para-educator should be promoting the child's independence so that it leads to maximizing the outcomes for the child. Moving on, one of the other areas where the para-educator needs training is what is called the Division for Early Childhood, DEC recommended practices. When you go to that website that you see on the slide, you will find that there are a lot of guidelines for teachers, support staff, therapists, and also para-educators who can benefit from these guidelines. And this is for promoting the development of children and maximizing their outcome. These are for children birth through age 5 who are at risk or who have developmental delays. And there are 8 topic areas. I'm going to kind of share just a little bit from 3 topic areas. For example, the environment. What does that talk about? It talks about how do you arrange the classroom? How do you provide the materials? How do you have toys and books? And how do you organize the routines and the activities that is supportive to the child? So that's what these guidelines under this title of environment addresses. One of the other areas which is critical is instruction. And this particular title, under this title, the guidelines are for maximizing the child's learning and improving the developmental as well as the functional outcomes for the young children. So it focuses on how do you provide intentional and systematic teaching using child-focused and best practice instructional strategies. The next one is the interaction. And to me, that is extremely critical because we have to make sure that the adult feedback to the child is encouraging and is constantly supportive to the child. Sometimes when we are faced with a child's difficult behavior, we tend to mark the sad faces rather than look at how, even if it is just for a few seconds, the child is demonstrating appropriate behavior. Instead of reinforcing that, we kind of tend to focus on the inappropriate behaviors. So it is important for the adult's interaction to be very sensitive and responsive. And it should promote the development of the child's language, cognitive, and social emotional competencies. So if you get a chance, please go to the DEC website and increase your knowledge and skills in this area. Moving on to how do you provide personalized supports for children who have special needs. This will apply to all children, but particularly for those with delays or deficits in cognitive or communication or social emotional skills. Teachers guide and coach the para-educators how to use a systematic instructional approach. In other words, you teach the simpler skills first and then move on to more complex. You teach one step at a time, and when the child has gained that, you move on to the next step, if that kind of adaptation is necessary. When you are teaching, you make sure that you do not reinforce incorrect responses, and you immediately correct the child so that the child understands the mistake or the error that the child made, and we don't say good job when the response is a prompted response. We only reinforce with a positive feedback when the child initiates the correct response. I'm not saying criticize a child when the child makes an incorrect response, but say, okay, no, that's not right. You just counted 4, but it was really 5. Let's count it again. Let's make sure that you count each one of them. Let's say that's just kind of an example. And also, it is extremely important that we limit the amount of information that we are presenting to the child at any given time. Let me go back to that same example. The child is counting. Instead of counting 10 plastic bears at a given time, for a child who is even not able to count, let's say, 3 correctly, it is important to move down and make sure the child is able to count correctly 3 and then move on to 5 and then move on to 7. The same way, if the child is struggling with recognizing colors and identifying and naming colors, we may begin with 2 and then immediately make sure we show the child a green leaf and say, this is green leaf. And we may show the child a yellow banana and say, yellow banana, and then move on to more complex colors like brown and purple and gray and all that. And in terms of prompts, it is important also to have training in how do you use a hierarchy of prompts. And it is important for the para-educators to understand because we easily go into providing total prompting with hand-over-hand physical guidance. It is important to begin with the least amount of prompting, least intrusive prompting, which would be modeling an activity, modeling a task for the child. You can combine it, if necessary, with verbal cues or gestural cues. That would be less intrusive. Then you can maybe do verbal and the physical assistance and the total guidance should be tried only as a last resort. And then hopefully with a few attempts at physical guidance, the child gradually learns how to do the task, and then you reduce the intensity and the intrusiveness of the prompt. Okay, as I mentioned before, it is important to use what is called errorless prompting. That is, we encourage the child to do the task and then we reinforce only the correct responses and gradually we fade the prompts. One of the most important things I think that research has found that we often, educators, teachers, para-educators, we don't give sufficient wait time for the child to respond. Some children hesitate to respond. Some children need an additional nudging before they respond. Some children need some kind of cues to respond. And we need to make sure we provide all that for the child to initiate that response before we move on to another child, or we move on to giving the child the right correct response. So we need to provide sufficient wait time, and the para-educators, particularly who provide the reinforcing of that particular concept, need to learn that. And also it is important that we train our para-educators, and para-educators learn that they don't use their body language and the facial expression. It is true for all of us. And the way we phrase the questions, through the tone of our voice, we are not alerting the child to the correct answer. And when we are collecting data, we want to make sure these kind of indirect prompts are not provided to the child. Let me give an example. A preschool classroom para-educator, Sarah, she was working with a 4-year-old child, and he was practicing counting skills. At the same time, she was marking on a data collection sheet, and she would say to Jonathan, "Give me 4 bears." And she would hold out her palm for him to give the 4 bears. As soon as he placed the 4 plastic bears, she would close her palm immediately, saying, "Good job," and that was kind of an indirect cue to him saying that he needs to stop. And then the teacher guided her and said, "Be sure that you don't provide accidental prompts to the child." And reflecting on her action, that was an aha moment for the para-educator. If I had not closed my palm, would Jonathan continued? Did he have the concept of one-to-one correspondence clearly? Do we need to practice that before we move on to 6 bears or counting 10 bears? So this is all important. But actually, this is important not for para-educators. It's important for all of us that we don't provide accidental prompts. Moving on to the next one, another example. Again, another para-educators. And these examples are actually based on some real-life situations that I have come across during my on-site visits. The early childhood para-educator, she worked well with the teacher and the young children. One of the students had a habit of annoying other children who were sitting next to him and scratching them. So based on her observation, she shared with the teachers her concern, if she could find out from the parent, if the parent was picking the child up every day, could I ask her today when I take her to the car, what the child like to do at home? Is there something, a preferred item that the child could hold on to during group time so that his hands are on the toy and not on other children? And it resulted in a very positive benefit for the child and the others, and it also helped the child to focus much more during the group lesson and did not make the group lesson a disruptive one when the child reached out. So the child got a stuffed animal that she was holding on to during the group lesson. So these are all things the para-educator can observe, note down, and share information and consult with the teacher, and then take the necessary action accordingly. So one of the things that the research has uncovered over the years, as we increase the number of para-educators supporting children, they have documented that the greater contact between the student, the child, and the para-educator sometimes has an adverse effect on the student learning and performance because of intrusive prompting. What happens is when there is a para-educator sitting next to the child or within 3 feet of the child, what happens is other peers, the others in the other students in the classroom do not interact with the child, and they kind of tend to stay away because they feel the para-educator is kind of the person who is going to be the child's kind of friend or the adult, so they move away and they don't interact. The other thing that they have found, and this I have actually observed, is that the general education teacher kind of steps away and feels it is the responsibility of the para-educator to provide all the support, all the guidance, all the teaching to that child with special needs who is in an inclusive setting. And so it actually affects the teacher involvement with the child, and it actually affects the child's academic outcome. And then there are times when the para-educators modifies the materials in terms of on her own because the child finds it difficult to work on the material that the teacher is doing. So the para-educator may take something else and may just work with the child separately and not on the same activity that the teacher is working on. And these things have a negative impact on that. So it is extremely important to note this and that this does not happen. And it is important to minimize that proximity. In other words, the para-educator should not really be sitting next to the child or within 3 feet of the child. I have seen during story time and circle time, the para-educator may be sitting right behind the child, and she may have her legs stretched, and then the child is kind of sitting right so that she can continuously control the child. And maybe we have to come up with other behavior adaptations rather than the para-educator proximity. And that support has to be discreet so that the other children do not view this child with something, oh, there is something wrong. Why is an adult always sitting next to the child? Also, it is important for the para-educators to mingle with all the other children in the classroom and kind of engage them in small group activity as long as the teacher is also supportive of that, and I hope this teacher is supportive of that. And also use an important, valuable resource that is available, that is the peers. They are the natural supports that is available in an early childhood classroom, and maybe they can provide some support and interact with the children. And for example, let's say during transitions and a child has difficulty walking in line or moving quietly or has a tendency to run, can the teacher provide another peer to hold the child's hand or provide something that they can carry with them, or they interact with each other, so that those kind of things will help minimize that proximity. And it is also important to train para-educators on both technology in terms of mainstream technology and assistive technology, and get familiar with that assistive technology, how to use it, because frequently when they are reinforcing, and especially in case of children who have communication difficulties, the para-educator may be carrying that device to different settings and enabling the child to have a voice to communicate with peers. And for that, the para-educators need to get familiar with using technology, and you will see both in terms of picture supports and in terms of actually a technology device. And we are moving on, that is in terms of instruction so far. We are moving on to the area of behavior support, because that is an important area where the para-educator provides support to the young child. One of the first things is the response to the behavior in an inappropriate or problem behavior is not reactive. That's one of the first things that all of us have to learn, but particularly the para-educator who is working with that child needs to remember that the response is not reactive, not stop that behavior immediately. Not that kind of a response, but stop that behavior with some preventive strategies before it appears. Usually, para-educators do observe. They have eyes all over their bodies, as I like to say. So they have to observe, is there any kind of a fidgety behavior? Is the child showing any kind of agitation or anxiety? Can something be done at that stage before it escalates into a problem behavior where the child needs to move away from the rest of the group? So that is important. The second thing in that, besides prevention, is how do we teach some new skills to that child so that the child learns replacement behavior. Like the example we had, the child touched other children sitting in the group in the previous example that I shared with you. By giving the child something to hold, it may be a fidget toy. It may be, in that particular case, it was a stuffed animal that the child held in her hands. It could be a fidget toy that the child holds. It could be a koosh ball. It could be maybe little silly putty that the child is rolling in her hands instead of reaching out, touching, scratching, or grabbing things from another child sitting next to the child. So can we teach new skills? These are things that the para-educator needs to be aware of. And also, it's important to catch them when they are behaving appropriately. Instead of marking a page of sad faces, is there a way we can mark a page of happy faces every time that the child is sitting appropriately, even if it is for 5 seconds? Can we mark a happy face? And when the child earns 10 happy faces, maybe the child gets to play for a couple of minutes with a favorite toy. And the other thing is, some children will need some personalized support, and we have to make sure that we provide that support for that. And it is important that has to be a kind of a team effort, everybody coming together, identifying what will work for that child, and then come up with that child-specific behavior support. And as I mentioned, positive strokes. Positive strokes does not mean constant praise in the form of good job, good job, good job, but encouraging feedback. Oh, you got 2 happy faces. Keep trying. You will make it to 10 happy faces. Then we move on to how do we make sure that the environment for the child, especially if it is in a general education environment where there are other children who may not need that kind of intensive support, but we need to make sure all children get this kind of a structured, predictable, and child-friendly environment. We have to make sure many of these centers and working areas and activity areas in the classroom are all clearly labeled and separated from each other. One of the things that will be helpful if you have children with autism in that early childhood setting, that there is no large open space in the middle of the room, and all the centers are not along the wall, but they are in the middle of the room so that there is no opportunity for a child who may tend to run across the room. So this is where the para-educator observing the child on a daily basis and provide that valuable information to the child. And I have just shown on this particular slide what are some things the way you want to label. You want to make sure that the classroom rules are not just text, but they are paired with visual, because that provides easy access actually to all children, not just children with autism or ADHD or children with intellectual disabilities. All children will benefit because visual information provides immediate access. And it is very, very important for all educators, and particularly also for early childhood teachers and para-educators, to be alert and aware that they are providing an environment that adheres to the universal design for learning principle so that the environment is accessible to all children. And we want to make sure there are visual boundaries for some children who may need that, especially that child who reaches across and touches other children or scratches other children. We want to make sure there is a kind of a visual boundary around the mat or around the desk when she or he is sitting. And one of the things that all early childhood classrooms can benefit from is a kind of a designated calming station or safe space so that when the child is feeling agitated or anxious, the child can take a few minutes break under the guidance of the para-educator, and of course this is something set up by the teacher and the para-educator, and the child can move to that place, calm down, and then return back to instruction. And sometimes we may have to have additional activity workstation for some children to calm down and complete that activity. That's why you have that picture of the marked work area. What are some additional preventive strategies that you can put in? Some children will need cueing them visually to classroom rules. Let's say you are moving from one area to another. You are moving from the classroom to the playground, or you are moving from the classroom to the lunchroom, or you are moving from the classroom to an assembly. It is important to carry a set of pictured rules that some children will need to guide them. When they are walking down the hallway, they are quiet. So you may want to have a small picture showing quiet mouth or quiet voices as they are walking down the hallway. But once they are in the playground, you don't need that rule anymore. And the same way, when you're going into the assembly and there is a special gathering, the child needs to be visually cued that they are quiet in that area, and you are making sure as a preventive strategy that you are sitting way at the back so that you have an opportunity for immediately leaving that assembly area. When the child starts kind of acting up, you have an opportunity to go to a corner of that assembly, calm down, and then return back. And so these rule cue cards, I call them pictured rule cue cards. They are portable. They are attached to a key ring. And the next slide will show you a picture. And as the child gradually gets used to it, you can remove this additional support for the child to be able to manage his own behavior, and self-monitoring will come to play. Okay, these are some of the rules that you can have. When they are sitting, they play, they have the eyes on the teacher, and the rule cue cards are attached to a key ring. And one of the major transition issues that comes up is when they are moving from one, as I mentioned, when they are moving from one environment to another. And frequently we provide verbal directions, but some children definitely need visual cues. We always have to have visual cues paired with verbal. And if it happens in the classroom or when you are taking them to the playground and some children have difficulty coming back to the classroom, you may want to set up a timer, or you may want to use music as a cue, or you may want to use a musical instrument to cue them that the playground recess time is over. And you want to make sure that you provide kind of advance alert a few minutes before the recess is over so that you can kind of provide an opportunity for the child to get used to the idea that the recess time is going to be over, now I have to line up. And the child maybe could carry that musical instrument or play that instrument. And one of the instruments that I like to recommend for an early childhood setting, it's called a stir xylophone. STIR xylophone. And as a matter of fact, there is a music CD that is shown at the beginning of this presentation. It's called Magical Musical Transition, that guide children and cue them to the next activity using music to provide the step-by-step transition. Okay, let's look at this transition scenario. Sarah, she throws a tantrum, refusing to come in from recess. And she is a 4-year-old child with autism spectrum disorder. Once she has gotten onto the swing, which is her favorite playground equipment, she finds it very difficult to let go and make the change to walk back to the classroom. In that struggle, frequently the paraeducator who is trying to get her off the swing gets hurt because she starts scratching, pinching, and sometimes even biting the adult. And so what are some things can we do? We just looked at different options, and can we try those things with Sarah? As I said, one of the most important things is 5 minutes line up, using a timer, playing a musical instrument, and once she hears the musical instrument, it's time for her. And then you pair it with Sarah moving through the different steps. So this is one issue where you may, if it happens every day, you will have a set of pictures to guide her to the classroom. And there will be certainly a big no in reaching and touching and pinching or scratching the adult. And when she is behaving appropriately and making the step and getting off the swing, she needs encouraging feedback. And of course, if becomes a major meltdown and you are not able to control it, you have to make sure you get some additional support for the crisis situation, and you have to make sure there are additional measures that you've taken in advance of that. Another one is every day when John comes in, he screams, cries as he gets off the bus, and he is not able to make the transition to the classroom. And what can the para-educator do when she goes to meet him? Greet John at the bus. Maybe she can use a song, and she can sing that song as she meets him on the bus. Another thing she can do is to carry an assistive technology device, a switch, where that song is programmed, just the first line of the song, and John gets to press the device, hear the song, and that kind of guides him. Another one is to use a kind of a transition marker attached to an index card, and he gets to hold it and walks back to the classroom. And that would be kind of a job for him to do as he carries it back to the classroom. Another option is that he could use a peer partner to hold his or her hand as he walks back to the classroom. The reason I'm giving different options is sometimes one option may not work, and you may have to try different options depending on the severity of the child's need. But we also need to make sure that we consistently try that option for several weeks before we move on to trying another option. And as I said before, we have to make sure we catch them being good. Praise is often underused, but what I mean by praise is encouraging feedback. It has to be specific to the task, not a generic good job, but I like the way, John, you walked very nicely from the classroom. You walked nicely. You got off the bus and you walked late, and you're going to do the same tomorrow and the day after. And the same way, I like the way you were sitting down and listening to the story. And one of the techniques to use is make sure the ratio of positive feedbacks is 4 to 1 corrective feedback. And in order for all this to work well, the instructional support, the behavior support, it is important for the teacher and the para-educator to collaborate so that the student will succeed and maximize the child's outcome. They have to commit to cooperation, and if there are conflicts, they are going to have differences of opinion because they are two different individuals, but you have to respect the different perspectives, and the para-educator has to learn to be open and accepting because the teacher is ultimately the instructional leader. But however, the para-educator may provide valuable information based on her data collection, based on her observational data, and they can work something positive in order to enable that child to succeed in that setting. And they have to ensure that there is constant and continuous and consistent communication, and maybe there is a daily meeting for a few minutes, or at least once a week they have to have a meeting where they discuss the children's strengths, needs, and preferences, and any issues that you have. And it is important to focus on the child's strengths and not needs. And ultimately, we have to all separate our personal and the professional and use the most easily available tool, the power of laughter. And the para-educator has to be a willing learner. She has to respect, or he has to respect, if it's a male para-educator, the differences, but ultimately all their work is for that child, and so they have to make sure they communicate regularly so that they are aware of any issues that the child is experiencing in that setting. There are a variety of resources I have included in the slides, and you will find a number of, for example, a book that I love. It's called The Paraprofessional's Handbook for Effective Support in Inclusive Classrooms by Theo Harris. And I also have, as I said, a training DVD on training para-educators, and several other books are listed. Again, a great thanks to AbleNet for making this webinar possible for all of us, and I hope you will take back these ideas and bring a lot of wonderful outcomes for young children. And with the increased number of children who are being served in early childhood classrooms, it is extremely important that that support is discreet, effective, leading to very many beneficial outcomes for the children, so that it will lead them for school readiness and school success. Thank you. Okay, I am going to move on to the chat section, the questions. One of the questions is it appropriate to sit by a student if they are a part of the group and sitting by their peers? That's absolutely fine as long as you are sitting not only by the student in a separate section of the room, but all around the table there are other children other children who are also sitting, and you are answering questions for everybody, you are interacting with everybody, but not just with that one particular child. The only problem comes when you are sitting away or you are sitting very next to that child and away from the other peers. One of the other questions is the presentation handout be available? Yes, most definitely. And I'm going to wait another couple of seconds and see. Looks like there are no other questions. Thank you very much, and this will end this session. And thank you to AbleNet again.